Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to my Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Thank you. Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 66. I have Imad-ad-Dean Ahmad from the Minaret of Freedom Institute. He's going to talk about liberty in the Islamic world and the prospects for liberty there. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah. First of all, let's start. What's your journey here as a libertarian?
Well, I've been a libertarian with a small L since I was a senior in high school. I got attracted to free market ideas when I read Barry Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative, but I never really understood the market well until I read Atlas Shrugged. And that's also from Ayn Rand's writings. I learned the word libertarian. And so I identified as such. The first political party I ever belonged to was the Libertarian Party back in the 1970s. I had not affiliated with any political party because of my disdain for politics in general. Um, but I've never been quite an anarchist either. I've always sat on the borderline between anarchy and the limited state. My view is a state which does not aggress is would allow for neutral resolution of disputes. The only thing is, I've never convinced myself that a state that does not aggress is possible. So I continue to sit on the fence.
So how did you reconcile Ayn Rand and Islam?
No problem at all. I believe that Islam prepared me for the philosophy of free markets. Now, there is an aspect of Ayn Rand, a couple of aspects of Ayn Rand's philosophy I can't buy, and of course, obviously, atheism is one, and the other is the notion of selfishness in the idea that we have no that we should not care about other people. Now, Ayn Rand herself has, I'm having a senior moment. I can't remember the word, but she's finessed that by while opposing altruism, endorsing beneficence. To me, that's just finessing. I do think that we have individual rights. I thoroughly believe in that, but I also believe we have communal responsibilities. In the Qu'ran, it's described as addressing neighborly needs. In other words, I like Thoreau's comment on this. He said, "As eager as I am to be a bad subject, I am eager to be a good neighbor," and I think that encapsulates my feelings.
Yeah, Thoreau was certainly a libertarian. I describe Rand's self-interest as, what they say when you're on the airplane. Please secure your oxygen mask before you try to help somebody else put on their oxygen mask.
Yes.
I don't. It's very interesting to see where Rand falls into that. But
one of my favorite quotes from Rand: "Before you can say I love you, you have to know how to say I."
Yeah, there's definitely, and there's also the realization that if you, the whole thing, and I don't know what Rand ever said about karma, but if you stop to help somebody who has let's say somebody's on the road and they've run out of gas and you stop to help them out, maybe somebody will stop and help you out when you run out of gas. I don't know, but Rand never wrote about things like that, but I think there's.
No, it's strange that the one thing that all religions have in common is the golden rule: do unto others as you have them do unto you. And so I firmly believe in that. I just think that some religious people overlook the fact that that part of that is having your rights respected. So just as I
Certainly,
want
yeah.
my rights respected, I'll respect the rights of others.
You said Islam prepared you for free markets. Where do you think Islam comments on free markets? I do know, for example, that Islam is very much in favor of a sound currency.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
true. But it's not just that. I mean, but some people are not aware that Islam was founded by a businessman. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was a merchant before he became a prophet. And not only he, but his wife was also a businesswoman. Uh, and and also the Arabs in general have always been a commercial people. Certainly, the Prophet's tribe was as one biographer said, the business of Mecca was business. They It's true that they had housed the Kaaba, which was a place of pilgrimage for the Arab peoples. But when they came for their pilgrimage, what did they do? They engaged in business. They traded with one another,
yes.
and it was trade that was the real lifeblood of
Yeah.
Meccan prosperity.
Well, also, I believe that's what the bazaar is. I mean, just everybody gets together and they sell all their goods and all their stuff. Do you suppose that sometimes I also believe that when you have people living in a very resource poor area, such as the desert, it creates much more industriousness. The people are, it's as if the conditions force them to work harder, so they do work harder.
Well, they had no natural resources
Yeah.
to depend on. They couldn't mine anything. It was long before the discovery of oil,
Yes.
uh, and so the only way they could make money was to engage in commerce.
Yeah.
And they were at the crossroads of some two very important trading routes: the north-south route between Syria and Yemen, and to the west to the Red Sea, and to the shipping lanes to all over the world.
Certainly, yes. And this was before the Suez Canal, so I assume they might very well have crossed the Suez manually during that time and to ship, or did they? Because they weren't going around Africa until I believe 14 or 1500 hundreds.
Well, again, the going around Africa was really only if you wanted to trade with the Western Hemisphere
Yeah,
and with Western Europe. They could go down through the Red Sea and cross to the Indian Ocean, up to the
yeah,
Persian Gulf. They could trade with Iran. They could trade with India. And of course, they could trade with all of East Africa.
yeah. It's definitely that area has long been a crossroads. But I mean, it's say if you're going from but if you're going from say Rome to China, you'd go across there by land. I don't
Right.
think it wasn't until the 14 or 1500s that route where they actually, I believe it was the Portuguese who realized, hey, we can go around Africa and go that way, which of course was still a much longer trip anyway, just because of the distance. But it
That's
was
true. But if
another
you
option.
traded with Syria, you could trade with
Yeah,
Europe through the Syrian markets.
I did not realize that Mohammed was a merchant. I know very little about his life. I mean, he had several wives, didn't he? Or
Later, his first wife Khadijah, whom he married before the call to prophethood, remained his wife up until she died. And while she was alive, he had took no other wives.
okay, yeah, and this was what in the 600s, 700s about.
Yes, he the call to prophethood came in 610 of the Common Era, and his famous flight to Medina, where he set up the first Muslim city state, was in 622.
622. Yes. Have you been to Mecca?
Yes, I went on the pilgrimage in the 1990s with my mother, and uh, it was a very, very interesting experience.
Was it? You haven't been back since, or?
Not to Mecca. I made a decision at that time. There's some people like to go there frequently. It's a
Yeah.
once. The religious requirement is to go there once, and I determined that I would only go there once. I would only go there again in the event that somebody really, really close to me had become a Muslim, and I would accompany them. But
Okay, yeah, I just wondered. What, and that would have been around the time of the first Iraq War,
uh,
maybe before it, before the invasion of Kuwait. And
no, it was. Uh, trying to remember. Again, my memory gets foggy going back that far.
yeah,
It was whether it was before the invasion of Kuwait. I believe it was before the invasion of
yes,
Kuwait, but I'm not going to
yeah.
swear to
So
that.
I wasn't sure. Yeah, obviously things probably changed. I was just going to ask you about if an American wants to travel to Saudi Arabia, uh, but things probably aren't the
Well, the
same
Saudis
30 years ago.
actually, the Saudis treat Americans very, very well. They treat them much better than they treat Muslims from other countries. For example, I have a friend who is an Egyptian American, and he went on the pilgrimage on his American passport, but he went with a bunch of other Egyptians traveling on their Egyptian passports, and he was so appalled by how much better he was treated than his fellow Egyptians that he actually refused to take advantage of they would like not require him to fill out certain paperwork, and they would just invite him in for coffee instead of making him stand in line, and he was appalled by this.
Oh wow, that's very interesting. So they don't really like Egyptians there, or is it just or is it
They
treat Americans
they
well?
they are well, at that time, this was a while ago, and things may have changed in very recent years, but at that time they really um, um, you know looked up to Americans because of their relationship, their alliance with the U.S. And of course, now that's changing, and there's talk about a shift to China and all that. That's outside my area of expertise, so don't ask me to comment on that.
Okay, yeah, yeah. A shift to China. What do you think's causing that? Do you think maybe it's because America has went crazy, or I mean,
Well, yeah, it's the Chinese have spotted an opportunity, and they're taking advantage of it. People, uh, the um, the Muslims can't quite figure out exactly where America is standing, other than solidly supporting Israel, which of course is not uh, seen as a positive thing. Um, so
true.
that you know
Mm,
for the Saudis again, uh, they had their alliance with the U.S. in the intervention in Yemen, but now that's beginning to look shaky, and
mhm.
their their position vis-a-vis Iran keeps changing, and the U.S. really when Trump withdrew from the nuclear agreement with Iran, he basically was giving Iran a green light to go ahead and develop nuclear weapons. And while they have not actually done that yet, their advances in refinement technology has just brought them that much closer to where they could do it if they wanted to.
So Saudi Arabia really doesn't like Iran.
Oh, they hate them.
Is that a Shiite Sunni thing, or
Largely, yes, and also for regional power competition.
okay?
Uh,
Yeah. So what do you what do you make of some of the situation with Yemen? Because I know there's been a lot of fighting there, and
yeah.
almost a
Well,
genocide, and apparently the U.S. is more or less supporting it. And,
yeah,
and Yemen is a very poor country, from what I've heard.
true. Um, it's a complicated situation. The Houthis are definitely not good guys. But like with so many of these other situations, that really doesn't justify the American intervention, which only makes things worse. You can say the same thing about Saddam Hussein, is definitely a bad guy. But of course, you can say the same thing about MBS, the head of this functional head of the Saudis. Uh, when we intervene, we only tend to make things worse. Um,
Yeah. Yes, it definitely seems that way. Which is why I'm not really opposed to it, and I really wonder if some of the what these countries really want peace or not. So, have you visited any other countries in the Middle East, or?
Oh yeah, well, I visited Jordan, both en route to the pilgrimage and also for my one visit to Palestine. We flew to that was back in the 1980s. We flew into Amman. I stayed with some relatives who were living in Amman, and then we crossed the Allenby Bridge and crossed over into Jerusalem. Um, and um, Spent a total of a week there. Also made a day trip to Damascus while I was there, um, and uh, uh, and I made several visits to Turkey and a couple of visits, three visits to Morocco.
Yeah. Okay. So
Oh,
yes.
also I visited Pakistan once.
Okay. So, but none doesn't sound like any of this was recent though. So, yeah.
Well, I haven't been anywhere since COVID.
Yeah. So, what do you think is the prospect? What how has your organization been received? Have you as promoting libertarian, promoting free markets and hopefully libertarianism among Muslims? Because it seems like this is one population that desperately needs this.
Yeah. Well, we've focused primarily at the intellectuals, and there we have been mostly very well received. Um, um, for example, there is a group of uh, free marketeers in the Muslim world that they call themselves um, uh, the Istanbul Conference because of the conferences they've held in Istanbul. They're modeled
Yeah.
actually on the Mont Pelerin Society, which you're
Oh,
probably familiar with. Uh,
yes.
a similar kind of thing, except focusing on the Muslim world. And they invited me to be their keynote speaker uh, in at a conference in Turkey, and also to give a speech at a conference in Pakistan, which is that time I made that one visit to Pakistan. Um, and um, I keep running into people who are now actively advocating for free markets and for liberty in a broader sense in the Muslim world, and they seem to all be familiar with our work. So
That's good. Uh, have they read Ayn Rand? Do you suppose it's maybe because they're very anti-communist, I suppose, and that's certainly a bridge you can build to them.
yeah, they're anti-communist. Uh, I I'm not aware that there's been any direct influence of Ayn Rand on any of the ones that
Yeah.
the people who are active in I'm going to call it the Muslim liberty movement. Uh, so uh, again,
Who?
remember, a lot of them are people whose first language is not English.
That's true too. Yeah, and maybe some of this stuff hasn't been translated. Who would be some of their who would be some of their people that we might know, or maybe they have some philosophers that we don't know.
Well, the person you're most likely to know is Mustafa Akyol, who is now at the Cato Institute, and um, I first met him in Turkey. He's Turkish, and yeah, but he left Turkey, um, around the time that Erdogan began to go go sour. Now, Erdogan is an interesting case, by the way. Erdogan started out as a free marketeer, and I suppose if you were to press him, he'd claim he still believes in it, but he's become so enwrapped with his own power accumulation that his policies have fallen far short. Uh, uh, when Erdogan first got elected, the Turkish inflation was horrible.
Yeah,
It was over 100%, and he got it down to 8% in a relatively short period of time. Well, unfortunately, now it's starting to climb again back towards 100%, uh,
yeah,
which just proves that power corrupts.
yeah. Mustafa Akyol. That's Mustafa Akyol. Yes, he's
Right.
Turkish. Yeah. Uh, so maybe he's done some or maybe he's writing his own stuff. Are
He's
there
writing his
any
own stuff. He's
Are
written
there
a
any
lot of.
great voices of liberty from the past that maybe we should at least know about?
Oh yeah, there's several, and the one that I really am just shocked that people don't know more of, especially because even Ronald Reagan knew about him and mentioned him in a speech, is Ibn Khaldun.
How do you
Uh,
spell
Ibn-
that?
yeah, IBN, which just means
IBN.
son of Khaldun, Khaldun. He was a historian,
Oh,
and he
yeah,
he,
Ibn Khaldun. Yes,
he wanted to
I
write
be
it.
yes.
He wanted to write a history of the world, and in those days it was common that when you would write a book, you would write a preface, an introductory of a few paragraphs or a few pages, an introduction to the work. But his preface, the introduction to history, ended up being 3 volumes. And in the course, he invented a whole new science. He's considered by no less an authority than Toynbee to be the father of sociology, of modern sociology.
Oh
And
wow.
he argued that when you study history properly, you find lessons to be learned
Yeah.
about what works and what doesn't work. And he
Yes.
talked about economics in a way that far surpassed anything by the ancient Greeks or even his own predecessors in the Muslim world. In fact, I once, Murray Rothbard, who's a good friend of mine, gave a talk once about the importance of the Salamanca school of Spain in influencing
Yes.
Western economics. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, well, Murray, I suspect the people in Salamanca must have been influenced by the Muslims from the Muslim era in Spain, especially Ibn Khaldun. And he said he didn't know because he didn't go back that far, but he wouldn't be at all surprised.
Yeah. I think to be a good libertarian, you have to know some history, just because you see how these things failed, and you can argue your way out of this. Khaldun, yeah, I had not heard of Khaldun myself. He was born in 1332 and died in 1406, at least according to as you said, the Common Era, not the Muslim calendar, which so that would have been so that also and with the Muslim influence in Spain, it could have very much influenced the school of Salamanca. What do you think?
Can I
Yeah,
just give you one Ibn Khaldun quote?
yeah, sure,
Ibn Khaldun says he had sub chapter headings in his book in his introduction
yeah.
to history, and one of the sub chapter headings is how government intervention in the economy brings about the destruction of civilizations.
Wow, yeah. And this was known a long time ago. I didn't realize how. Also one person we often, I don't know where he would have been, but what about Omar Khayyam?
Well, Omar Khayyam is an important figure philosophically. I'm not aware of anything he did that touches on economics. But what's so incredible about Umar Khayyam is that he pondered questions that we consider very, very modern questions, including difficult philosophical questions about the relationship between determinism and free will. And so he was very, very much interested in questions about personal responsibility in general. I don't think he ever I'm not aware of his ever talking about them in political terms, um, but in philosophical terms, I would say he was
Yeah,
a philosophical libertarian.
yeah. Well, also, do you think you can run into problems because of the language differences, that maybe they don't have words that are as accurate as we are? I mean, because it's a very different language, of course.
Yeah, the well, of course, Umar Khayyam wrote in Farsi, but
Yeah, Persian.
the official language of the Muslim world has always been Arabic.
Yes.
So, and Arabic differs from English in that English is the definition of words tends to be more precise. Arabic is a more poetic language where words can have multiple meanings, and so when you write something, there's all kinds of allusions that are incorporated into it, and you can go off in many different directions. Um, um,
Certainly. What do you are you partnering with any other organizations like the I know there's the institution for there's like secular Muslims and stuff like that, or not?
uh, we have in the past collaborated with, for example, the International Institute of Islamic Thought,
Yeah.
with the Association for Liberal Thinking in Turkey, um,
Mm.
um, the um, the Istanbul conference. Um, let's see who else. Uh, I just got an invitation uh, to host a book forum by um, an organization that uh, um, they're doing um, a book forum on um, uh, r- racialized Islam. And I've worked sometimes, often, uh, well, on our website, we put up summaries of the activities of a lot of other organizations whose work touches on what we're doing. For example, there's an organization called the Council for the Study of Islam and Democracy. And although they focus much more on democracy than on liberty, nonetheless, they've had some interesting, speakers and fora
Yeah.
we've summarized.
I think a lot of these people, because they've never had democracy or anything resembling democracy, they are completely unaware of all of its failures. And I just say to them, no, democracy doesn't solve these problems.
Well, the thing is, you want what you want is a liberal democracy, and that's why I was
Yeah.
so interested and fascinated with the progress that was being made by Tunisia. You know, Rashid Ghanouchi, I think, is a great example of someone who's thoroughly steeped in the Islamic tradition, and as a result, is inclined towards liberalism. But the thing is, unlike other people that I could point to, like say Erdogan, Ghanouchi has been so consistently pro freedom that even when the Arab Spring took place in Tunisia, and of course Tunisia was the one Arab country which we all had the most hope for, when they were doing their constitution, as all the different political factions were fighting to put their slant on what democracy should look like in the constitution, he was the one who insisted it can't be majority rule. When it comes to the constitution, we need as close to consensus as we can get, because and it's in a constitution, it's got to be something that everybody, absolutely everybody, agrees to. And because there were so many different factions, you had in Tunisia, of course, you had the Islamists, you had the secularists, you had the leftists, uh,
Yes.
and you had the liberals. To get them to all agree on something was, was very very hard. In fact, I'll draw a contrast between Tunisia and Egypt. The Islamists momentarily, there was an Arab Spring in Egypt that elected the party that was created by the Muslim Brotherhood, and that party totally blew it. And one of the ways they blew it, one of their um, aficionados here in the United States, when I was criticizing what they were doing, he said no, they're being very open minded. They went to the leftists and the secularists and the liberals, and they said to them, uh, look, uh, anything you guys three can agree on, we'll sign on to as well. And I said, that's not leadership. You know, those three groups are not going to agree on anything. Leadership is to put forward something that they can all sign on to. And this is what the Ghanouchi did in Tunisia. So the Tunisian constitution was wonderful. Unfortunately, we had an elected president who decided that he was going to disenfranchise the other branches of government, dismiss the parliament, and has now, uh, interfered with the function of the judicial branch in order to try to make himself into a dictator.
Yeah, and this happened in Tunisia around 2010, 2011. Uh, what do you think? What is the closest thing to a libertarian country in the Muslim world? I realize none of them are particularly close, but what would you say is the best right now?
I would say the best was probably, I don't know if it's still true because they've had some setbacks, but at one point I would have said Malaysia was the closest.
Oh, I didn't necessarily think of Malaysia as Muslim, but yes.
Yeah, most people don't, but in fact, it is overwhelmingly Muslim.
Yeah.
And it was the government at one point. The economic minister was um, um, oh, Anwar. I can't remember. I'm trying to remember his full name. I'm having another senior moment. But anyway, he was someone who is trained in classical liberal economics, and his economic reforms were, just great. Unfortunately, he had a harder time trying to get freedom for the civil society, which he we had him as our speaker at one of our annual dinners here at the Minaret of Freedom Institute. And he said, much as he values free markets, he said the real challenge is trying to get a free civil society. Uh, One of the things that many people don't think of when they think about how society operates is that it has three aspects to it. Most people are well aware of the government, and of course, free marketeers are well aware of the markets. But there's also civil society, and civil society is, one third of a successfully functioning social system. And it's and like the market, it has to be free in order to function successfully.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You're right. Malaysia is majority Muslim. And what do you think there are any others that you're optimistic for?
In the long term, I'm optimistic for all of them because the arc of history tends towards liberty. uh, but for the short run, I don't know. I don't really see anything that I'm thrilled about, other than the possibility that the Tunisians may succeed in uh, disposing of their would-be dictator and getting back on track. Um, Egypt has backslid horribly. Palestine is not only under Israeli occupation, but the Palestinian Authority is not a good example of good governance. Um, um, Turkey, of course, now is
Yeah.
going through its bad phase.
Mhm.
Um, um, uh, Saudi Arabia, Syria, they're all horrible. I suppose one could point to the United Arab Emirates and say, at least economically, they're doing relatively well.
There's some
Um,
progress there. Yeah. I do. Yeah. I was gonna wait. Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. One thing. What about Oman?
uh, Oman, again, like the other Gulf
Mhm.
states, there probably economically is not too bad, but I think it suffers from the same problems most of the Gulf states do, that of maybe overly socially conservative and overly insular, in the sense that if you're one of the native populations, you're probably relatively free. But if you're part of that immigrant workforce, things can be very, very bad.
Okay. I've heard the same thing too with with Dubai. You hear about these people being imported to do hotel jobs and stuff, and they just get exploited terribly. What do you think about some of the some of the prospects in some of the countries where there's a mixed population, like say India or Malaysia or uh,
Well, in India is in a very bad situation now. The BJP, and I want to make it very, very clear that I make a distinction between Hindutva and Hinduism. Hinduism is one of the great religions of the world, and it's got a lot of good teachings, great teachings. But Hindutva, it's like the distinction between Islam, which obviously I I believe in and try to practice, and political Islam. Uh, I see the same thing. The BJP is essentially a political agenda trying to hijack a world religion to its service, and unfortunately, it means persecution of the Muslim population and of the Christian population as well. In fact, pretty much all the minority groups. But the Muslims get it worst
Yeah.
because they're the biggest minority, and it's people are always scared of the biggest minority. It's like here in the United States, there was a time when the Jews and first the Catholics got it because they were the biggest minority, and then once the Catholics got accepted as being virtually white, then the Jews became the biggest minority. They had it the worst. Now the Muslims are seen as the biggest
Well,
minority.
there's other places too where you have other situations like the Rohingya in Burma.
That's right.
Uh, yeah,
You,
any other
and, and
places,
and and
and
and
any other
unfortunately,
situations like that that we should at
well,
least
yeah,
be aware of.
sure. I mean, I think that we have to be concerned about the persecution of the minorities in Malaysia. Although the persecution has not been on the same level as
Yeah.
the treatment of the Rohingya, but they're doing downright embarrassing things. Like in Malaysia, there's a movement to prevent the Christians from using the word Allah to refer to God. Now, because the God of the Christians and the God of the Jews and the God of the Muslims is all the God of Abraham,
Yes.
to say that the Arabic word for God can't be used by the non-Muslim population of Malaysia is silly at best. Um,
Yeah.
and I think in Indonesia, there's also a possible problem. Again, Indonesia classically has been very, very good to its minorities, but there's been this infiltration of ideas, Wahhabi ideas from Saudi Arabia, and that does not bode well for.
Well, hobbyism seems like it's a very serious problem. Do you think it's going? Where do you think it came from, and what do you think? What do you think is going to happen with it?
Well, those who don't know, the movement was started in the 18th century by Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who formed an alliance with a man who wanted to be the leader of all the Arabs, king of all the Arabs, Muhammad ibn Saud. And again, this when you mix politics and religion together, you're going to degrade religion. And his views were so. He was claiming he was going back to the original Islam. He was criticizing how liberal Islam was, and he wanted to go back to what he conceived of as the original Islam. But his ideas were so wrong. Even his own brother and his father, both of whom were religious scholars, distanced themselves from it. Um, anyway, the Saud tried to use this interpretation of the religion to make himself kings of all the Arabs. The Saudi family made three attempts. The first two failed. The first one was defeated by their own people, and the second by the Ottoman Turks, who occupied the country at the time. But the third succeeded because it was aided by the British, who were involved in World War One. And if you've seen um, Lawrence of Arabia, then you get
Yes.
a glimpse about what was going on there. And so they were finally set up through the use of their alliance with the British, and they then started to export their ideas to not a good result. Most Maybe the most tragic example of the export is the Taliban in Afghanistan. And this is, by the way, maybe should be the number one example of how American intervention, gets undesired results. The intervention was started because, of course, the Soviet occupation of
Yes.
Afghanistan, which you're naturally opposed to, and many groups, the most effective fighters against the Soviets were the Mujahideen, people who were, believing Muslims and didn't mind dying in the
Yeah.
cause of freedom. But the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan worked together to cultivate, to try to create the next generation of mujahideen by taking the students, mostly orphans. And this is, by the way, this is where the word Taliban comes from. Taliban is the Arabic word for students. So they took these students and they created textbooks designed by the Saudis. The logistical support was provided by the Pakistanis, and the money was provided by the Americans to set up these schools where they would basically be indoctrinated in fighting against the occupation. And to give you an example of how this was done, their arithmetic textbooks would have examples like um, if Fuad has six uh, machine guns that he can use to kill the occupiers, and he gives two to Zaid, how many does he have left to kill the occupiers? Um, well, after the Soviets were driven out and the Americans came in, of course, this philosophy was then turned against the Americans.
Yes. Yeah,
And
that's a classic. Speaking of interventionism, what would Iran look like today if the U.S. had not thrown Mossadegh if the U.S. and British had not helped overthrow Mossadegh?
yeah, well, I don't know that I can really answer that question with any certainty,
Yeah.
but I could certainly say it wouldn't be any worse, and it would probably be much better. Um, in fact, a very prominent convert to Islam, he went by the name of Muhammad Assad. He was born Leopold Weiss. He was an Austrian Jew, and his family, who were Zionists, sent him to Palestine. But while he was there, he became uh, an Arabophile and became very interested in Islam, eventually embracing the religion. But he traveled throughout the Muslim world, and he traveled to Iran, and he was horrified by the way that the Western powers had intervened to prevent Iran from establishing a republican form of government in the 20th century. And he said that he had no doubt that an Islamic republic would have been successful in Iran, that it was what the people were aching for. But the Westerners were worried about foreign policy, and they all wanted a there's this belief that dictators are easier to control. And, if you have a democracy, you don't know what the people are going to vote for. And also in democracies, people are very reluctant to vote for wars in any case. The
Yeah,
costs are too high.
well, democracy is also less likely to vote for corporate welfare, which is what they want.
Oh, well, that's right. Of course,
Yeah.
the overthrow of Mossadegh, as you are certainly aware, had a lot to do with the oil industry and the fact that
Yes.
Iranians wanted to repatriate the industry to Iran and take it away from the Western powers who had
Yes.
developed it. So,
Yeah. Okay. Well, wasn't sure. It's always something that's always one intervention that I can think of. Commenting on war. Obviously, do you think are the Palestinians? Do you think some of the Palestinians think they're actually better off under Israel than under the Palestinian Authority? Or do you think it's a mixed bag?
no, the reason the Palestinian Authority is so unpopular is because it's seen as the enforcer for Israel.
Okay.
And those who are directly under Israel are not. Now, some people might argue that those who are Israeli citizens are slightly better off in that they have certain civil rights that are guaranteed. However, those civil rights don't help them as far as their daily life is concerned, because they're trumped by things like regulatory agencies and so on. If you want to, if you want to expand your house, let's say, and you file for a permit, it's almost certainly going to be denied. So, uh, so what good is the fact that you have the right to apply for a permit if it's going to be denied in practice?
And although also, have you paid much attention to the situation with Azerbaijan and Armenia?
Not too closely, but I'm obviously aware of uh, the the hostilities that have arisen out of the rivalries there. But I can't comment. You know,
Okay, yeah, because Azerbaijan, I've heard, is also and Turkey does not have very good relations with Armenia either. Do you think there's any chance that Turkey will at least acknowledge and admit that they did something wrong and say, okay, we can't change it, but and obviously everybody who was involved at the time is dead now, but
yeah,
at least acknowledging that it happened would be a step in the right direction.
yeah. I would love to see them acknowledge the wrongdoing. The trouble is that people who are trying to insist that they call it genocide are, only hardening the resistance for their admission of the wrongdoing. But that's not to say that if the demands were made more reasonable, that the Turks would be any more reasonable in response. I don't know, but
Okay.
at least it would.
Yeah. Looking also at some of the looking at some of the intellectual history of in the Islamic world, Baghdad was very much a center of learning. The word algebra initially comes from Arabic, and our number system comes from the Arabs. I mean, we had some really great mathematicians there, 1,000 years ago. What created this great intellectual life in that world, and what happened to the intellectual life there?
Well, I wrote a book about this called "Signs in the Heavens,"
Yeah,
about, and really, I think it all goes back to the religious teachings of Islam. Islam is a very rational religion, and the Quran appeals to the rational mind and encourages people to use their senses. It asks us to look, even if it asks for a belief in faith in the unseen, it asks for us to look at the seen, because in the seen, in the signs in the heavens and in the earth, is the evidence of the creation, and therefore of the creator. And There's a passage in the Quran I love. It says, look at God's signs in the heavens. Do you see any flaws? You will turn away weary, but look again. Um, and I've always understood this to mean that if something in nature seems like it doesn't follow, um, uh, you know, uh, the laws, the laws that God has set down for nature, then our theory must be wrong. It's not nature that's at fault. Look again until you figure out what's wrong with your theory. And in my book, I point out how the Muslim astronomers put Copernicus's not Copernicus, Copernicus came later, Ptolemy's theories to that test, and they said
yes,
that whereas Ptolemy had very very adequately explained the motions of the planets, he never attempted to explain their size or their brightness. And if they really moved the way he said they did, then at some times in its orbit, the moon would be twice its size. Venus and other planets would be much brighter or much fainter than they are. And they said, look, you have to be able to explain everything, not just the positions. And it caused the great Muslim, one of the great Muslim astronomers, to come up with a system that it was still a geocentric system, but it corrected Ptolemy's theories in such a way that if you took his system and you could simply switch the positions of the Earth and the Sun, something you couldn't do with Ptolemy, and you would have the Copernican system. And in fact, that's what Copernicus did. Copernicus would have learned, because he studied astronomy at Padua, where they were very familiar with Islamic astronomy. And Copernicus took that system and he simply switched the positions of the Earth and Sun and came up with what we call the Copernican system.
yes. And it's also very interesting to note that many of the Greek classics survive only in Arabic today.
Especially interesting is the fact that the Western world got Aristotle through the Arabic translations, um, because the Greek of all but one of Aristotle's books were all lost to the West. And so they discovered it when they conquered Spain, and they got their hands on Ibn Rushd, known to the West as Averroes. Averroes
Mhm.
is translations of Aristotle into Arabic, and they translated it back into Latin, and from there it influenced Thomas Aquinas. And one of the fascinating things is, whereas Aquinas always referred to Aristotle as the philosopher, he also referred to Averroes as the commentator.
That's very interesting. I didn't realize. So you're saying all the Greek classics were lost and weren't available in Greek at all?
All of Aristotle's books except one had been lost to the West.
So you couldn't get them in Greek at all. So everything we read nowadays is obviously not. If we read something in English, we're now reading something that's maybe third or fourth hand, is what you're telling us, or maybe second. Yeah.
Well, it's a secondhand translation from Greek to Arabic to
Yeah.
Latin. Well, if you're reading it in English, yeah, it would be fourth hand.
But
Greek
I
to
mean,
Arabic,
it does.
Latin to English.
Yeah, but it does raise the question of what do you lose if you translate? I mean, even if I translate something from English to Spanish and then have something translated back to English, do I get something that's exactly the same? I may not.
You may not. And what's interesting though is not just what you lose, but what do you gain? Somebody who once heard me give a lecture in which I commented on the fact that Aristotle believed in a prime mover, said to me, well, how do you know that Aristotle really believed in a prime mover and that wasn't something that came in from the translations from the Greek to the Arabic?
Yeah. So what do you think happened to intellectual life there? Because I mean, we don't really see any great accomplishments coming out of the Arabic world after that. Maybe in the last
Right.
500 years. I mean,
Yeah.
we don't see great inventions. We don't see new inventions. We don't see new ideas.
Yeah. Well, my position, again outlining Signs in the Heavens, is that there was uh, a turning away from those Muslim teachings that made this possible in the first place, and I do blame the intervention of the state. Um, the Muslim jurists who created the Islamic law in the early centuries of Islam were all independent from the state. And there's famous anecdotes about how much they sacrificed in order to maintain that independence. There are four Sunni schools of thought, and I think three of the founders of three of those schools all served time in prison. And in the case of Abu Hanifa, who founded the Hanafi school, it was because he refused to accept an appointment uh, by the Khalifa, a political appointment. In the case of Ibn Malik, whose school is very prominent throughout North Africa, it was because the founder of the Khalifa offered to make his book of law the only book of law, or the only book of jurisprudence
Yeah.
in the country, in the empire, and he refused. He said, "Why would you deny me the benefit of the criticism of my peers?"
Wow. Yeah, that's wild. Yeah, yeah. So
So,
yeah, where do you think? Uh, it's crazy, but how would the entire Arab world look today if the U.S. had never stuck its nose into any of these countries?
uh, I think that
Including giving aid and not giving aid to Israel as well.
well,
Yeah.
not giving aid to Israel, I would be able to speak to directly because I thought
Yeah.
a lot about this for obvious reasons. Again, I am a Palestinian,
Yeah.
and I also firmly believe that it is the creation and ongoing support of Israel that has been, if not at the root, at least compounded all the other problems that
Yeah.
the U.S. has had. the Muslim world.
Certainly, and at least going back before, Israel, wasn't the perception of America in the Arab world a very positive one?
Oh yes, yeah. The Arab world looked up to the United States. Their aspiration was to be more like the United States, and uh, the uh, the current perception of the United States as being, well, as the Iranians would say, the Great Satan.
Yeah.
People forget that they came up with that phrase "Great Satan" because they were referring to Israel as the little Satan. And they looked at the
Oh,
U.S., the great Satan, who's behind all their problems, not just Israel, but you name it. Obviously, the intervention in the Iranian, the Mossadegh regime, overthrow of the Mossadegh regime, but just about everything. And I think that it's been American interventionism is the reason. It's not because of any hostility towards America itself, although again, Muslims tend to be socially conservative. So you can point to, for example, um, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, who, when he studied in the United States, was, appalled by the mixing of the sexes in the U.S. But that doesn't explain the hostility of the Muslim world.
yeah, that can be a lot of different things about some cases. I believe in some cases it's illegal for men and women to go to the swimming pool together or something like that. It's
Mhm.
or gyms working out. It's a what do you yeah so where do you think so yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, so do you think this is going to go away anytime soon, or is it still going to be a force? Because it doesn't seem like that. I guess I'm more pessimistic about all this, but
Well, I'll tell you, I'll point to my one ray of hope here.
yeah,
Um, if we're right that support of Israel is the biggest single contributing factor, um, the Jews in America are changing their attitude, especially younger, young people. They are beginning to look more closely at the dynamics of what actually happens in in Israel and how the Palestinians are treated. And um, and I think that because it's the um, unconditional support for Israel that the United States government gives is the only reason that Israel can afford to be so intransigent. That support in the long run is threatened now. But the question is, you can say, well, how long is the long run? How long is it going to take before uh, the U.S. Congress actually says, for example, there's Betty McCollum's bill. I don't know if you're familiar with it. She introduced a bill that says that we should at least cut off the aid that's being used to imprison children in Israel. And how long before even that bill can actually pass, let alone to cut off all the other aid that's going on? So that's a tough question. Uh, and I just have to fall back and say, well, in the
yeah,
long run, I'm optimistic. In the short run, I'm afraid it's going to take a while. We can see. I mean, it's interesting. I don't know if you're aware of this. When the um, evangelical Christians
yeah.
appealed to Donald Trump when he was running for office, they made only two demands on Trump. They only had two demands. One
Okay,
was one was appoint judges to the Supreme Court that'll overturn Roe v. Wade, and the other was move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
yeah,
Now, the first one, despite the fact that I'm a libertarian and so I'm pro-choice, the first one I can understand. That's an American issue, right?
yes.
The second one, well, there are explanations for that, but but
I don't know. I'm not really. I didn't want to go down the rabbit hole with Israel either. Also, What do you think about the whole situation with the Uyghurs in China?
Yeah, well, I think that's it, I would have thought that that was a straightforward, obvious case that pretty much everybody could agree is wrong. The formation of concentration camps where you take people and you put them in and try to force them to alienate themselves from their religion should be an obviously wrong thing. And most people think it's wrong, although they may not put it up high on their list of things to be concerned about. But you know who doesn't seem to be bothered by it? The Arab dictators. Some of them have
That is
actually.
interesting. It seems like the Arab dictators, or the Arab dictators, are, they talk about the Palestinians, but they don't talk about some other oppressed Muslims in other countries.
Yeah.
They don't really talk about the Rohingya either, do they? I mean, they just in Burma,
Not, yeah.
or
Well,
Myanmar,
not
I
as.
guess we should say. Yes.
Yeah. Again, it's not a priority for them. I think if you ask them, they'll
Yeah.
say, "Yeah, that's bad."
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
but the
And
thing
yeah.
but the thing with the Uyghurs, just leaves me speechless.
Yeah. I don't know. Do you think wasn't the isn't as the situation with Sudan and South Sudan pretty much peaceful now, because wasn't that basically a Christian Muslim split
Yeah,
when
that
South
that
Sudan split off from the
that
upper
was a
part of
Christian
Sudan?
Muslim split, and it was peacefully resolved, maybe because the U.S. didn't intervene. But
Could be.
unfortunately, Sudan now suffers from a a civil war uh,
Yeah.
between two militia groups, the military and
Mhm.
another militant
Yeah.
group. So
Yeah.
it's it's like whack a mole.
Yeah. And I get and of course I hope the situation's and would you say also the situation in the countries which used to comprise Yugoslavia is pretty much peaceful, or is that still somewhat of a mess?
Well, it's neither open warfare nor is there uh, the kind of official uh,
Mhm.
um, the war crimes that had been going on at earlier. Uh, so, relatively speaking, I think things are peaceful there, but it's not still a lot to be done. But it's at least it's not like Syria or Yemen.
Certainly, yeah. Hopefully, we can get a peaceful resolution there. Uh, and what about Lebanon? It was pretty much a mixed country, but isn't it? It sounds like the Christians and the Jews are basically leaving there. I mean, God Saad, of course, being one of the more prominent Jews who left it, Lebanon.
Well, the source of the problem in Lebanon was the Lebanese constitution. It was set up at a time when the proportions of Christians and Sunni and Shia Muslims was not what it is today. And it fixed into the Constitution a representative system that assumed that that would always be the case. And when it was no longer the case,
Hmm.
it became impractical and counterproductive and led to all uh, the conflict. Uh, and they still haven't sorted it out. Uh, and the continuing, now added to it the pressure from the border disputes with Israel, as well as, of course, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Um, it's it's only made things worse. And then you can add to it on top of that now recent economic issues that have arisen. Uh, so it's
Certainly, yeah, yeah. Well, that's certainly interesting. I'm trying to think if there are any other countries we haven't touched during this talk. There's a lot of them. I don't know.
well, there's a
Maybe,
lot, but
yeah,
I mean, look, I want to mention Morocco.
yeah.
Morocco is a mixed bag. There's a lot of good about Morocco, and there's some bad
Yes.
about Morocco. But one of the worst things about Morocco is their claims on
The Western Sahara?
Yeah, the Western Sahara. And of course, Israel has just made that worse by offering to support their claim in an attempt to get Morocco to normalize relations with Israel.
I wasn't sure. I don't know if it was maybe the Spanish influence that had harmed Morocco. It's hard to say.
The Spanish influence.
I,
Well,
how many countries that
Spanish.
were Spanish colonies are doing well? Yeah, it's a yeah, it's a
I hadn't thought of that, but it's a good
yeah.
question.
But anyway, it's I don't know if it was yeah, but Morocco is certainly a yeah. I've not visited there. I mean, if you were going to go back and visit a Muslim country today, which one would you visit?
Ooh.
And are there any that an American definitely should not visit?
Well, I'm tempted to say don't visit Afghanistan, although actually,
Definitely not. Yeah.
there's a journalist who produced a lot of good stuff from Afghanistan and managed to, you know, and it was a female journalist too. So, you know, maybe that's exaggerated. I look, when I went to Pakistan, there were some people who, you know, try to caution me against it, or to at least be very, very, very careful.
Yeah.
When I went, but when I went, the only people who looked like religious fanatics on the plane were two men from Kashmir, and they were very friendly. They were lovely people. So I don't, you know, I said in the sense they had long beards and so on. People were warning me that because I didn't have a beard, you know, that fanatics would kidnap me, and I think that the fears are overblown.
Certainly, yeah. Well, that's good. Yeah. I mean, you got to be careful though.
You have to be careful, but I think it's it depends on how you treat other people.
Yeah, and so in some cases too, you know, these countries aren't that easy to travel to anyway. It's you know, we didn't really say anything about Libya either.
Yeah, I think if there's one I would be hesitant to go to. Yeah.
You know, isn't it fair to say that Libya is kind of a, I don't know, I'd call it a manufactured. There are different tribes there. I mean, because you know, basically the European powers just drew lines on a map and said, "We'll call this a country," and you have different tribes in Libya. It's not really a unified country.
Yeah, well, that's true of most of the countries. And one of the reasons some people were optimistic about Tunisia is that it was pretty homogeneous.
Yeah.
But that's not the case in Libya. But it's also not the case pretty much anywhere there. The line deliberately drawn in order to have hostile people together, in order to try to keep the countries in the thrall of the former, you know, imperial power, even after the imperial power nominally left.
Yeah, you know, another thing, you know, do you think we'll ever see an independent Kurd country?
Yeah, that's you know, really unlikely, but it's got to be. They you know, again, I'm not a fan of the nation state, but if you look at the theory of the nation state, it was that you should allow people who are, you know, have a common background to be self-determination and rulers.
But if every Muslim country becomes libertarian, is it really going to matter where you live anyway?
No, it wouldn't.
Yeah, and I know also we haven't touched on, but there are some small, you know, still little provinces or areas, you know, of Muslim populations who live in Russia, like the Chechen, or at least occupied by Russia. We could say the Chechens and some other tribes in the Caucasus region, for example. And
well, you know, going back to actually your one of your earlier questions, first questions about, you know, the Muslims' appreciation of these ideas. Sometimes people have volunteered them to me, not responding to anything I said. There was a man from Egypt who was sitting next to me one time during an Eid al-Adha event at the Islamic weekend school where I was teaching. And a lady was giving a lecture about the sacrifice of Abraham. And it was exactly the kind of lecture you'd expect to be about the sacrifice of Abraham. You know, how he loved God so much that he would even sacrifice his own son. But God loved him so much that he would, substitute a ram for not let him sacrifice the son, and so on. So there was nothing, controversial about it. But the man from Egypt turned to me and he whispered, he said, there's not a single Muslim country on earth where she'd be allowed to give this lecture. I said,
Yeah.
What? Why not?
Yes.
And he said, in half of them, they would say that she's a fundamentalist, and in the other half, they'd say, why is a woman giving a lecture?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Half of them, they say she's a fundamentalist. Also, also some of the former, Soviet, like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, are also largely Tajikistan, also largely Muslim. Turkmenistan. Anything with a stan is basically Muslim,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I've heard some of the Central Asian countries are actually very, very poor on civil liberties, but I've not been to any of them.
Yeah, I've not been to them, and I've heard the same thing. They tend to have authoritarian governments.
As bad or worse than the Soviet Union in some cases. Yeah. So, also,
That I don't know about.
also, and there's a substantial Muslim population in Mali and Senegal and some other countries like Nigeria. And
Well, the largest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia.
Indonesia, yes.
Yeah. Which is not only not an Arab country, but is very, very it's not even in the Middle East. It's in the Southeast Asia.
The other thing too is that, especially with a country that usually a country like that isn't very unified either way, because people almost think they identify more with the island that they live on than the actual the country. So I'm not really from They might say I'm not from Indonesia. I'm from Borneo, or I'm from Sumatra. I'm from Java. There's definitely you end up with these inter-island rivalries, I believe, and also because you just have this natural barrier and this natural division that's occurred.
It could be true. If I'm going to be honest, I'm going to tell you that the Palestinians are kind of like that. Everybody's from this village or that village.
This village or that village. I mean, sometimes it's just because the people are divided. It's you don't get out and talk to people. But obviously, for before we had the transportation we had today, we didn't have much in the way of a way to unify these people at all. So it's been very interesting. So what else gives you? I should ask too. What was the Arab world like during the times of the big bad virus?
The COVID virus?
Yes. And the crazy response toward it. I mean, I went to the Caucasus region last August, and I could get into Georgia, and I could get into Armenia, or I could get it, or Sakartvelo and Hayastan, but I couldn't go to Azerbaijan because they still had restrictions.
Yeah, I don't know anything about that. I couldn't say.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have any allies that are working to do your work for you around the world, or who are some of your other allies right now besides the guy at Cato?
Well, I already mentioned some
Mustafa
of the
Akul.
There's a group called Ideas. What's this? I can't remember what that stands for, but they're pro free market group of Muslims, and there's the Association for Liberal Thinking I mentioned.
Yes.
And let me see. Yeah. They're the ones that are explicitly libertarian. But as I say, we have good relations with a lot of different organizations that are not explicitly libertarian, because they are vaguely pro-freedom.
Yeah.
And
Well, do you have some places, for example, where they're very much, say, pro free markets, but they're still going to arrest gay people for having sex or stuff like that? Because even in America,
well,
we have some people like that who are very pro free markets, but very puritanical on more social issues.
well, you're going to find individuals like that
Yeah.
every.
Yeah.
So yeah, but and I mean, I would. Well, I'm reluctant to say, since I don't know for a fact. But let me just say that I would guess that some of the Gulf states may be like that. For example, certainly, um, you know, the Saudis uh, claim, at least, that they're pushing for more, freer markets right now. But I'm not aware that they're interested in changing their attitudes towards
Yeah.
on other
Well,
issues.
well, isn't Saudi Arabia though kind of like Venezuela's, that they just extract all the oil and then they use that money to create all these socialistic programs and give freebies
That's
to people?
that's what yeah, that's what they have been in the past. But you see, MBS makes these claims, and like I said, I don't know if I give any credence to them. That he wanted more diversity in the economy, so it wouldn't be so highly dependent on oil in the future. Now, what has he done to bring that about? I'm not really aware of anything. But some of the other Gulf states have been doing something. The United Arab Emirates, for example, has been doing something, but I doubt that their social attitudes have changed a whole lot, although they maybe changed some. I got to tell you, when I visited Dubai, I went to buy a bathing suit, and I wanted to buy a very modest bathing suit. But the guy in the store kept trying to push me in a Speedo.
Oh, really?
So, yeah. And I said, that's
Interesting.
not for me. I don't, I,
That one thing I've noticed, if you go back and watch a basketball game from the 80s or the 70s, though, and you'll actually see them where they're I mean, they're not these, they're not, complete, as high as you can go, but they do wear a real pair of shorts. Nowadays, you practically got these so-called shorts that do come all the way down to the knees, which I think are kind of ridiculous, and you can't even really get, a pair of gym shorts anymore. Uh, I don't know if it's that way over there. Yeah, yeah. What do you think about some of the the occasional Muslim violence that happens in Europe? What do you make of all that? Do you think that's going to go away anytime soon, uh,
well, again,
or
the occasional violence, you're going to have people, sometimes it's people politically motivated, but a lot of times it's people with
yeah,
mental problems. And
yeah,
there's a kind of double standard. People are very, very quick to realize when there's a mental problem when the perpetrator is a white Christian, but it takes them a while, if ever, to even consider that possibility when it's a brown skinned Muslim.
yeah? Well, and of course some of the riots that happen over the cartoons, the famous Muslim.
Mhm.
I mean, that's certainly an issue. I think, which is I mean, it's a cartoon, so what? It's. I, the, I mean, for me, one of the I don't know how anyone can say words are violence, or there's a very clear boundary there. If you don't know that boundary, it just opens up a can of worms for problems.
Yeah. Yeah, I have that problem with people, but it's not limited to this area. It's
Yeah,
becoming ubiquitous, and it's not that I don't realize that words can be hurtful, and I do think it's bad manners, and I don't advocate that kind of a thing. But to say that it's equivalent to physical violence is just insane. It's not equivalent to physical violence.
certainly. Yeah, I mean, and certainly the difference. What do you also make of the situation with do you also think that Muslim population growth is continue? I mean, because in some cases, I think Islam's going to be all that's left because they're the only ones that are having kids.
I think the Catholics are still having kids, but
Maybe they are.
but,
Maybe, yeah,
and also I've heard some Israelis claim that Orthodox Jews are having more kids now.
Actually, that is true. Israel actually does have a fairly high birth rate because of that. The much more the much more conservative section of the Jewish of Israel's population is might have 5 or 6 kids, and that's what's keeping the population increasing. It's very interesting that way. And
Yeah, I remember a
yeah,
conversation I had a couple of decades ago with a Muslim immigrant about the sources of the rise of the Muslim population in the United States and what was the relative contribution of immigration and conversion. And he said, don't forget reproduction.
certainly, yes. Reproduction, and it seems like to me these are, I'm very much in favor of living in a society where at least we have good marriages and have people stay married. I mean it. I, I mean it's not really easy to get a divorce in any Muslim country, is it? If you can get a divorce,
No,
I don't know what
it
the
is
laws
easy.
are there. Oh, it is easy. Okay, yeah.
Oh yeah, Islam, while it has a kind of ambiguous feeling towards divorce. On the one hand, it is relatively easy compared to other religions that preceded it to get a divorce. However, it is also, there's a saying, what we call hadith, a saying of the Prophet, peace be upon him, in which he said, of all the things that God allows, there's nothing he hates more than divorce. So it's something not to be entered into lightly. But the legal requirements are pretty simple. For a man, all he has to do is, declare the divorce and stick with it for 3 months, and let the woman keep the gift that there's a gift he's supposed to give the woman, uh, technically at the time of marriage, but in practice payable no later than divorce or death of the man. And for the woman, she can declare a divorce on the condition that she refunds the gift to the man. So that's
Okay.
pretty easy. And then, of course, there's also divorce with cause. That's a little harder, but it's no harder than any legal divorce in the U.S. I don't think.
I don't know. America seems to have a culture which encourages it. I don't know if that's a.
No, okay, definitely Islam does not encourage divorce. It discourages divorce, but the discouragement is a moral discouragement. It's not legal obstacles thrown in the way.
It sounds like to me some of the Islamic countries are really more just governed more by social pressures than law.
Well, that's an interesting point that Rose Wilder Lane made in her book Islam, and on the discovery of freedom. She had a chapter on the role Islam played. And she said one of the fascinating things was that she observed in the Muslim world was when people had a dispute between neighbors, they would rarely have to go to the courts because the other neighbors would come in and intermediate. And and if you did go to court, it was pretty much the same kind of scenario that played out, where everybody has their say,
Yeah.
try to work it out rather than have a dictum that says you're ordered to do this. That's sort of like the last resort.
Well, you can certainly remember, that might have been in the past. Well, I'd like to get divorced, but my family will disown me if I get a divorce, or and
Yeah. Well, that I'm sure still exists in the Muslim world. It's uh, because I also work, besides the Minaret of Freedom Institute, I work for a charitable organization called the Islamic American Zakat Foundation. And I'm aware that there are people who want to get divorced, but they're reluctant you know, to even make the announcement of the divorce because of the way everyone is going to treat them.
and maybe there's more incentive to work out. I knew another guy who visited Jordan, and he loved the people in Jordan, but he said that part of the problem was. Do you think there's a tendency that some cultures are more likely to tolerate being ruled or governed by sociopaths and dictators than others? I mean, do you think Islam encourages, you know, the people to tolerate a Saddam Hussein or an Ayatollah Khomeini, as opposed to whereas other people might not be willing to put up with people like that in positions of authority.
Well, the original Islamic teaching, the Quran does not, but there is a in the Sunni world, there is a strain of jurisprudence that has arisen that has said that it is better to be misruled than to engage in an uprising, and that the only reason that and again, I don't agree with this, but I want it is a very widespread and probably the dominant view in this among Sunnis that the only reason that justifies an uprising against the ruler would be if he's so oppressive that he's preventing you from practicing the religion. That anything less than that, it's better for the society that you tolerate it and put up with it. And certainly that could go a long way to explaining what we see.
You know, one thing I do have to comment when you were talking about, intellectual life in the Islamic world, I do have to bring up the fact that, you might know Maryam Mirzakhani. She was a scholar from Iran, and she was the first woman to win the Fields Medal, which is basically considered the Nobel Prize for mathematics. And of course we've had so many great mathematicians come out of the Islamic world. And she's a woman coming out. You wouldn't expect that the first woman to win a Fields Medal would have come out of Iran, but I think it's unfortunately she died of breast cancer at the age of 40, which is very much a tragedy, because she probably would have done a lot of amazing work otherwise, even after that. But where do you think where do you think you're making inroads in the Islamic world, in the intellectual life of the Islamic world? What are some of the famous universities or places where there is this being promoted right now? I know so little about it. Of course, the library at Alexandria got burned, but what are some of the famous universities that maybe we should know about?
Well, the Library of Alexandria was burned before the rise of the Muslims.
Yes, of course.
There's the whole. Again, this is one of the things Rose Wilder Lane pointed out, was the Western notion of a university as a marketplace of ideas is something that came out of the Muslim world, because in Western Europe, the university was a place to train theologians. In Islam, in the Muslim world, what would happen is that people would come to the mosque where they would look to be educated in Quran or in the Hadith, and so they would then come to the mosque to be educated in other things as well. So the teacher would sit down on a low chair with the students on the floor in front of them, teaching whatever subject. And so when you wanted to learn, say, mathematics, you'd go to the mosque and you say, "Where's the chair of mathematics?" And they would point you to the right direction. And that the Western universities still retain those designations of the chairs of the different departments.
The chair is a person who just leads a meeting. In Robert's Rules of Order and stuff like that. Yeah, the chair. Yeah,
the chair. So anyway, so it was because all knowledge was religious knowledge. You could go there to study anything, and the curriculum was self-prescribed. They didn't have degrees in the formal sense of the Western university, but they had certifications. When you successfully completed a course, the teacher would give you a certification proving that you had successfully completed the course. I'm not surprised at all about Iran. One of the good things that came out of the Iranian Revolution, other than the overthrow of the dictator, was the fact that women could start going to school, because the Shah's prohibition of the hijab, of the headscarf, resulted in women not wanting to go out in public because they didn't want to take off their their headscarf, and to go to school under the Shah, you had to take off your headscarf in school. Now that restriction was removed, there are now more women than men in the universities in Iran.
Yeah, I've heard that. Yeah, it's very very interesting to see where it'll all end up. Yeah, the intellectual life, it's quite amazing. So, what other things are you optimistic about right now? I mean, where do you think this is all going to go? Do you think maybe Islam will de-wokeify Europe and maybe make Europe freer? Because there's certainly a growing Muslim population in Europe.
That's a tough call. The you know the anti woke movement is a mixture of people who are concerned about liberty and people who just prefer the conservative way of doing, the social
Oh yes.
conservative. So if someone who wants to replace an oppressive, you know, progressive regime or progressive policy with an oppressive regressive policy is not a step forward. Like in Iran, it's wonderful that the women can now go to school, but now they have to wear the headscarf.
Yeah.
So that so it's really just a mirror image of the problem under the Shah. The idea that that people should be allowed to judge for themselves what is appropriate, what is pious, is something that's very deeply ingrained in Islam, in the Quran, but it's not necessarily widespread among the population. So, in my position, and I've been a university chaplain and an imam, and one of the things that I've focused on with young people is make your own personal relationship with the Quran. Read the Quran for meaning and see what it says to you. Because the alternative is that you don't read the Quran at all. You just go to some authority. Authority, I'm putting in air quotes here. You go to an authority and say, what's the Islamic position on X? And the authority gives you an answer that may be right or wrong. And,
Yeah.
then you have to live with that.
Yeah. What do you think of Ayaan Hirsi Ali?
Ayn Rand is an example of the anti-Muslim Muslim. Although she never, as far as I could tell, she never was a practicing Muslim, never observant, and but can because her family, which was a highly secular family, attempted to force her into an undesired marriage. She's now able to go and claim that Islam is horrible and get a lot of money from the Islamophobia industry.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. Do you think there are other people? Do you think there are others like that as well, or?
I'm sure there are.
We certainly hear. I mean, we certainly hear story. We certainly know that arranged marriages happen, but I don't know how.
Well, the problem is not arranged.
But they have with a lot of religious groups too. Yeah.
Yeah, the problem is coerced marriage.
Yeah.
Because I remember I had a student in the Islamic weekend school where I taught, who was complaining, or not complaining, but saying that she did not want her parents to, to arrange a marriage for her, but at the same time was complaining on how difficult it was to find a guy that she wouldn't even want to marry. And I said, well, why can't you? Well, actually, no. She started out by complaining how hard it was to find a guy that she would want to marry. And I said, well, if you ask your parents to help you with this. And she said, I don't want an arranged marriage. And I said, I don't mean that they would coerce you in a marriage. I mean, help you to look. And she said, oh, you mean like fix me up? I said, yeah. She said, yeah, that'd be fine.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Don't force me up. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That's certainly a positive step. Yeah, it's certainly a, a good way to go. Yeah, there's a lot of as you said about the industry. It's like the whole thing. Where it does seem like a lot of politics is just playing on fears.
Well,
I mean,
yeah. I mean, if you're going to get somebody to hand power over their life
yeah,
to you, uh,
yes,
fear is a pretty effective tool.
yeah. The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed, and by an endless series of how as H.L. Mencken said, by and hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary. That's what H.L. Mencken said. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, Also, it seems like to me though, could Islam help restore the West to maybe becoming a little more pro male because the West has become very anti male now. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. To be honest with you, there was a guy there's a couple I was counseling recently, where the guy complained that he thought Islam was too pro female.
Oh, yeah.
Uh, because all the Muslims he knew were saying to him about how he should respect his wife and her rights. So um,
Yes.
I don't. Yeah, I don't know. I think that maybe what Islam could do is to uh, help to remove. Uh, help to remove the question of gender from uh, being the issue, in the sense that the Quran is very clear that people are judged by their deeds and not by their gender or their race or their tribe or ethnicity or any of that stuff that for some reason people seem to think is so important. Um, the, um, there's a verse again in the Quran I'm fond of quoting: "To men is allotted what they earn, and to women is allotted what they earn."
Sounds good. Yeah. You have anything to say about Ilhan Omar?
Uh,
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 in Congress?
in Congress.
Yeah.
Um, well,
From Somalia.
I don't share her views on a number of issues. But I do respect and admire her as a woman who is able to, you know, uh, succeed in her chosen field of politics, and I do appreciate her outspokenness on the Palestinian issue.
Yes. So, yeah, is there anybody else out there that you think that you really admire or you really respect, who you think's becoming a good ambassador? Um,
Well, I mean, there are many people I admire and respect, but who is out there in the public eye? Uh, the trouble is well, let me put it this way. The trouble is we tend to focus on political figures, and as a libertarian I tend not to be particularly crazy about any political figures. Even the ones I admire, it's just relative. They're better than the others. But there are people who are making waves in science and in industry. um, uh, you know um, you mentioned the woman who won the mathematics prize, but
yes.
the couple who came up with the COVID vaccine, there's a Muslim couple, and although I don't remember their names, but uh, uh, And the number of very successful Muslim entrepreneurs. So, but they're not people that they're not recognized. They're not known because the media tends to focus on political figures.
Yes, it does focus too much on political figures. I mean, as I pointed out, so many people know who, I mean, most of the people don't know who the, Maryam, Maryam Mizakani, who won the Fields Medal. I mean, most people don't know about her. We don't really know some of our great people have. Maybe it's just because we have so many people achieving so much in science nowadays that we just don't know that we just take them all for granted that they're all going to happen. I know from my own hometown, one of the richest men in my hometown was a Pakistani immigrant who came and was an eye doctor.
Oh, in the medical profession.
Yeah.
You probably anybody who asks me, where's a successful Muslim scientist, I'll say, well, what's the name of your doctor? And the odds are pretty good that it'll be a Muslim doctor.
Yeah, it's certainly been an interesting conversation we've had here. Well, do you have anything else you want to say before we go?
Well, I'll just add this. It's usually what I start with, but in the definition of a Muslim is the word Muslim means submission to the will of God. The definition of a Muslim is someone who voluntarily submits to the will of God. The idea that someone could be coerced into being a Muslim is self-contradiction. And therefore, from that premise, if the most important decision you make in your life, which is what's your relationship to God, is something that you have to choose, then shouldn't we say that's pretty much true of all of life? And the only way that the state can justify its imposition in somebody's choices is where harm is being inflicted on other people.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And any websites we should go to?
Well, I recommend minaret.org and blog.minaret.org.
Yes.
And if you're interested in other broader questions of libertarian policy, I recommend the Cato Institute, cato.org.
We certainly have lots of organizations out there, but I just think I wanted to plug yours.
Okay.
So thank you very much. I'm Chris Baker. Please like, subscribe, follow, and tag this video, share it around, and go buy my novel, Escape from the Village. I'm Chris Baker, and we are out.